Good morning, everyone. My name's Annie. You might have seen me around ringing the bell to try and get you back here after break. And this morning it's my great honour to introduce our next speaker, Professor Robert Costanza. I've really admired his work ever since I first encountered it, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who can say that it's had a huge influence on my interest in and understanding of ecological economics. I'd particularly like to acknowledge his pioneering and groundbreaking work on natural capital and ecosystem services. Yeah. Professor Costanza is an extremely accomplished author. He has authored or co-authored more than 600 scientific papers and 27 books. He's the Vice-Chancellor's Chair of Public Policy at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University, and he also holds some other interesting positions which are described in his biography in your programs. We are so lucky to have him here to share his knowledge with us today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Costanza.
Great. Well, thank you, Philip, for this opportunity, and it's great to be here, and welcome everyone. My background is actually in systems ecology. I took economics as a foreign language as part of my PhD. So I'm coming at this really from a systems point of view, and acknowledging that the economy is a subsystem of society, which is a subsystem of the larger ecological life support system, which I think is the basic idea that ecological economics is kind of based on. So the importance of natural capital and ecosystem services. You probably all have heard this term Anthropocene before. Has anybody not heard this term? Put it that way. Oh, a couple. Okay. It's acknowledging that we live in a whole new geologic epoch. You know, that because of the magnitude of the human influence on our life support system, that business as usual is really not an option. We live in what Herman Daly has called a full world, and I think this is also a motivating idea for ecological economics, that we can no longer assume that the economy can just continue to grow without any impacts on itself and on our well-being, more broadly conceived. And it also is focused on the idea that we need to create a sustainable and desirable world in the Anthropocene. And to do that, we need to think and act, I think, quite differently than we had been doing in the past when we lived in a relatively empty world. So I think this is a major change. So, it's past time, really, to build this economy based on the goal of sustainable well-being of humans and the rest of nature, recognizing that that this is all one integrated system. It's not humans and nature; it's humans and the rest of nature, and get past this mindless pursuit of GDP, which I'm sure, as you've heard, was never designed as a measure of societal well-being, and might have been okay in the empty world context because that was the limiting factor, but now in the Anthropocene, we've got to move beyond that. So how do we create sustainable well-being? I think we need these three elements in an integrated way. First, to have an adequate vision of how the world is, our scientific understanding. And certainly this has been growing quite rapidly as we learn more about how the Earth system functions, but also how human psychology works, the whole science of well-being and the science of happiness. And all of those pieces need to be better integrated than they have in the past. I think that's also what ecological economics is trying to do. How do we put all of those pieces together rather than thinking of them separately? But secondly, how would we like the world to be? We need to spend a lot more time thinking about the kind of world that we really want. I think the UN Sustainable Development Goals is a big step in that direction. But I think we need to have a much broader discussion among society. In fact, I think that's what democracy really should be all about. How do we build a shared vision of the kind of world that we really want? We can't predict the future, but we can create the future. And in order to do that, we need to know where we're going. As the famous American philosopher and baseball player Yogi Berra once said, if you don't know where you're going, you end up somewhere else. So where are we going? That's, I think, a critical thing. And then we need to integrate that with the appropriate tools and analytical techniques. And here I think this whole idea of systems thinking and modeling is really critical. How do we think about the whole system in an interconnected way? And how do we implement these strategies? I think we need new kinds of institutions that can better deal with the Anthropocene situation that we're in, that take better concern, particularly for common assets, for community public goods and things like natural capital. Here's another way of looking at what we need to think about here. How do we integrate our societal goals, with how do we change worldviews and values and cultural choices? How do we understand the history and the evolution of the system from the past into the possible futures? How do we think about, what are the possible futures going forward? From undesirable business as usual scenarios through more desirable, sort of scenarios. How do we figure all of this out? First problem is that we're still stuck, I think, in a lot of our policy thinking in this empty world vision of the economy. We had these three primary factors of production: land, labor, and capital. You can see that land is kind of grayed out there because there's an assumption of almost perfect substitutability here. You don't really need land or natural resources. You can just continue to grow the economy indefinitely. And as measured by GDP, we're producing goods and services, and that's is that better? We then either consume those goods and services in the current period, or we reinvest them and build more capital so we can continue this growth process indefinitely. So there's nothing in this vision of the economy that would limit growth indefinitely, and that's sort of the underlying goal. Individual welfare is based on consumption. The more we consume, the better off we are. So that might have worked okay in an empty world situation, but in the full world, I think we need to change that vision significantly. First of all, to recognize that we don't live, in a vacuum. We live in an Earth system that's materially closed, that's driven ultimately by solar energy, either current solar energy or stored solar energy in fossil fuels. That these four basic types of capital are all required in a more balanced way to produce conventional goods and services, but also to produce well-being more broadly conceived. And the fact that not all of our well-being comes from the consumption of goods and services. In fact, a lot of that well-being comes from our relative consumption, not absolute consumption. So there are social factors embedded in that even. And these four types of capital are the conventional built infrastructure and built capital, human capital, individual people, but not just their labor, it's their health, their information, their well-being as individuals. But then there's social capital, all of our formal and informal interactions, among people, our friends, our family, but also our culture, our institutions. The market itself is a form of social capital. So it's extremely important in maintaining the economy and maintaining our well-being more directly. And finally, natural capital, everything else in the system that we didn't have to build or maintain, the free gifts of nature, which produce a range of services that we often don't acknowledge well enough. And as I said, our well-being is a much more complex function than simply the more we consume, the better off we are. Certainly we need to have consumption, but there are a whole range of other factors that influence people's well-being, and the whole science of positive psychology and a lot of the work that's going on now in terms of figuring out what actually does contribute to people's well-being. I think it needs to be taken into account here. So I'll focus today on natural capital and ecosystem services, which are the benefits that people derive from functioning ecosystems, from our natural capital. And this is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Many of you have probably seen this diagram in one form or another that breaks these, or categorizes these services. There are many different lists. into these 4 categories of provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services. So things like, food and fresh water. We all recognize that those are important. But regulating the climate, regulating flood protection and storm protection. There's a whole range of things that ecosystems do for us that are kind of in the background that we don't recognize fully. And certainly our cultural and aesthetic amenities and how they contribute to this whole range of constituents of human well-being that goes much beyond simply consumption. There is one thing missing from this diagram, and that's the interaction with the other 3 forms of capital that I mentioned. So sustainable human well-being really comes from this interaction of human-built social and natural capital. Doesn't flow directly from natural capital, but requires that there are people to benefit. There's some built infrastructure and social capital to moderate that interaction. So I think this is really what the challenge is going forward. How do we build a world that balances these forms of assets in a way that's both sustainable and that contributes maximally to human and the well-being of the entire system? I don't think you can separate those things. It's not an either or. There's been a lot of recognition, I think, of this idea of natural capital recently. There's something called the Natural Capital Coalition. That's an international collaboration of financial and insurance institutions that are looking at how natural capital affects these things. And they've begun also to integrate this natural capital concept with social and human capital, along with built capital. So beginning to take on this idea that managing our system requires that we think about all of these assets in a more integrated and coordinated way. You probably heard of the IPBES or IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Quite a mouthful. It's kind of the IPC equivalent for ecosystem services. They'll be coming out with some major reports and have been and will be coming out with major reports on the sort of status and trends of ecosystem services and natural capital around the world. There's something called the Ecosystem Services Partnership, which is a global organization. Take a look at their website if you want to know who's doing what in this area on ecosystem services, and perhaps join that partnership. The interest in the academic community has been going up exponentially in recent years. This is just the number of papers published per year in Scopus. You can see there are over 4,000 papers per year now published on this topic of ecosystem services. The most highly cited of those is this one that we did back in 1997, where we tried to estimate the total value of all of these 17 different ecosystem services across 16 different biomes, and we came up with a number which was significantly larger than global GDP at the time, and a conservative estimate by any estimation. One thing we didn't control was what they put on the cover of the magazine. They said pricing the planet. We didn't really mean pricing. We meant valuing, as you might have picked up from the former talk. Not all of these values that ecosystems produce, in fact, many of them, if not most of them, are not exchanged in markets and shouldn't be exchanged in markets. They're really public goods that contribute to our sustainable well-being without ever entering the market system. So how do we put all of those pieces together? Well, this was an estimate with a capital E, I've got to say. But I think it made the point that we're missing a big proportion of all of the things that contribute to our well-being. And we put it in units that I think could be comparable with other things that people understand. I think there's some mistaken identities concerning this idea of ecosystem services and valuation. First of all, the economics is not the market. The market is one institution that helps us to manage our affairs. But economics really should be, how do we manage our affairs? How do we manage the earth, literally, from the Greek roots? That valuation is not the same thing as privatization or commodification or trading these services. It's really trying to say, what is the contribution to well-being? And expressing these services in monetary units is not the same as saying that they are market or exchange values. It is about trade-offs, though. What are the trade-offs between different contributors to our well-being, and how do you assess those trade-offs? And if you can put at least one of those units in monetary terms, then you can you can at least talk about those trade-offs in the same units. And lastly, we can't avoid valuation, because that's about making trade-offs. And so every decision we make about ecosystems is really an implicit valuation. So we're trying to make them more implicit, and recognize that this valuation is going on all the time. We also need to recognize that most ecosystem services are not rival and excludable types of goods, or at least the systems that produce them are not. And the market really only works well with those types of goods. That non-rival, non-excludable goods, pure public goods, common pool resources, are not really well handled by market mechanisms. And so we need to develop other ways of valuing those and other ways of managing those kinds of resources. There's a whole range of uses for this valuation of ecosystem services and natural capital, including simply raising awareness and interest. And this Nature paper that I mentioned probably had that major result. But also modifying national income and well-being accounts. There's the whole, SEA process, System of Environmental and Economic Accounts, that's beginning to finally take ecosystem services and natural capital into account. Various science and policy, specific policy analyses, urban and regional land use planning, this idea of payment for ecosystem services. Can we pay farmers to produce not just crops, but to produce the other ecosystem services that come off of their land, and thereby protect those kinds of public goods. That system has been used quite extensively around the world in many places, started in Costa Rica. This idea of full cost accounting, so how do we actually bring in the damages, the costs of everything that we do? I mean, none of the prices that we're paying in the market are not the real prices. They're ignoring all of these external costs, and there is certainly a lot of effort to try to do that. And finally, this idea of common asset trusts, that to manage these systems effectively, we can't manage them with markets. We need to think of them as common assets and manage them from that perspective. This is an interesting survey that was done a couple years ago, published in the Journal of Environmental Management, where they asked Australian coastal and marine managers, 80 of them, they said, well, how important do you think it is to value this list of ecosystem services? And you can see from this result, generally they thought it was pretty important. On the other hand, they asked them how much they trusted these value estimates, and you can see that was a little bit less good. So I think there's a lot of work still to be done. How do we better value, how do we better understand these complex interactions between our economic, social, and natural systems? And how do we better understand the trade-offs here in terms of contributions to well-being? So there's a lot to be done. There's some conventional methods that have been used to value these contributions. And I don't think there's any one right way to value ecosystem services, but I think there is a wrong way, and that's to not value them at all. And that's what we have been doing, unfortunately. So there are things like avoided cost. I'll give a quick example of an avoided cost technique, and some of the sort of pseudo markets where we can ask people in a contingent way how much they would value different services contingently. But I think in the future we need to bring in more group valuation, recognizing that if these things are public goods, we really shouldn't be asking individuals to value them and then sort of aggregating those valuations. We should be asking the whole community to deliberate on these valuations and ask them to do it that way. And finally, there's better ways of modeling these interactions for things that people really don't perceive, and we shouldn't expect them to perceive. But we need to take our scientific understanding of how the system works and integrate that into the process. And we need to recognize that there are, from an ecological economics perspective, as Herman Daly said many years ago, there are three basic sub-goals for sustainability. Economic efficiency, but also fairness, both among the current generation of people, but also between the current and future generations, and between humans and other species. And sustainability. Is the system really going to last and continue to produce well-being? And our approach to valuation really needs to be very different in each of those three cases. the efficiency goal. We might use conventional techniques, but I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. The fairness goal, I think we need to talk about how do we deliberate as communities in order to evaluate things. And the sustainability goal is going to take a lot more modeling in a scientific way. I'll give you a quick example of this avoided cost approach. How do you actually come up with numbers for some of these things? This is the value of coastal wetlands for storm protection. And this is Hurricane Katrina approaching the coast of Louisiana back in 2005. Problem in Louisiana was that over the years, this is 1839, 1870, the deltaic plain, the coastal marshes in Louisiana have been disappearing at a rapid rate, largely due to the leveeing of the Mississippi River and all of the sediments that were building that deltaic plain now going off the edge of the continental shelf. Oil and gas exploration in that area as well. So a lot of these coastal wetlands that were formerly protecting New Orleans from this sort of thing are now gone. And so when that hurricane hit, you got these sorts of damages. We were able to look back historically and say, well, we know the tracks of historical hurricanes. We know the damages that those hurricanes caused. We can take each hurricane and look at, in its swath, how much wetlands were in that swath, what was the GDP, the infrastructure in the swath from nighttime satellite imagery. We know the damages, we know the intensity of the storm, so we know those basic factors, and that simple model we can put together and say that the relative damages are really a function of two things: wind speed and wetland area. These tended to be the two biggest factors in that database. And from that, then you can estimate, the change in damages. If you increase or decrease the area of wetlands by a hectare, how do you expect those damages to change? That explained about 60% of the variation in the relative damages across these 30 storms that we did in the U.S. And then we can use that to map both the marginal value, what's the value of the next hectare, but also we can integrate under that curve and get, what's the total value of wetlands for storm protection by square kilometer here. And you can see that from this map, the high values are where those three elements come together, where you have a lot of infrastructure to be protected, you have a lot of storms to be protected from, and you have a lot of wetlands to do the protection. So the bottom line is, these are pretty valuable systems simply for storm protection, not even recognizing all of the other 16 ecosystem services that they're providing. And if you add it all up, they were providing $23 billion a year in just storm protection services. And these were not really considered, they're not part of the national income accounts, they're not part of the books. But again, these wetlands are providing a whole range of other services. And the first thing the Corps of Engineers said after Katrina was, well, we know how to solve that problem. We'll just build a big levee along the whole coast of Louisiana. And that should do it. Of course, that would not solve even the storm protection problem, but it would also not provide all of the other services that these wetlands are providing. And now I think they've changed their minds, and there's a whole strategy now to try to rebuild some of these coastal wetlands, to divert the water from the Mississippi River, et cetera. So we're trying to extend this kind of analysis to other countries and ultimately globally. This is a recent study of China's coastal wetlands and seawalls. They've done a lot of this seawall construction, and it turns out that coastal wetlands are much more effective, much more cost-effective at protecting from storms than seawalls. And we know that land use change in general is reducing the value of land in terms of, if you look at the total contribution from both the marketed and non-marketed ecosystem services. Again, this is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. When we convert an intact wetland to intensive farming, we're losing more than half of the value of that system. It's going to private farmers, but it's being taken away from the public in general. Likewise, for many other land use conversions. Several years ago now, we did a global assessment. What's the benefit-cost ratio of conserving our natural capital assets? And we used a scenario where we increased the global reserve network to cover 15% of the terrestrial biosphere, 30% of the marine biosphere. That would cost about $45 billion a year to build and maintain. But the net benefits, the difference between that intact system and what it would be converted to, is about $4 to $5 trillion a year. So Again, a conservative benefit cost ratio of 100 to 1. Anybody know of a better investment these days than 100 to 1 return on investment? I could only find one, and that was for oil companies investing in political campaigns in the United States, and probably in Australia as well. So, but there are better investments here. And there's been a lot of work recently on this whole nature-based solutions, and I think you find this in many different circumstances, that if we preserve our natural capital assets, we're going to do much better as long as you consider the full range of benefits that these systems are providing. There was something called the TEEB study, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, which updated some of the unit values that we calculated for these different biomes. And you can see that they're incredibly valuable per hectare per year. They're producing coral reefs in particular and coastal wetlands, are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per hectare of social value. We use that information to estimate, how has the situation changed from when we did the study in 1997 until 2011. What's happened largely because of land use change. There's desertification, there's loss of coral reefs, loss of tropical forests. How has that changed the value of these services? And we estimated because of that, largely because of that, but also because of better estimates of the unit values, we've lost about $20 trillion a year, or are losing about $20 trillion a year of ecosystem services because of that land use change. What's going to happen in the future? Well, we can use scenario analysis to basically look at what the possibilities are. And this is a group of scenarios from the Great Transition Initiative, where they looked at these 4 basic possibilities. The market forces, or the business as usual scenario, the policy reform that, where there's more government planning and more emphasis on trying to maintain equity. Both of these are still focused on GDP growth as the goal. If we focus on well-being, more broadly conceived at the community scale, then we have what's called the Great Transition. We're all in this together. We need governance at many levels. We need stewardship and sharing. That scenario, I think, is very consistent with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and where we're trying to head there. What are the implications of those scenarios for ecosystem services, however? So we did this analysis where we looked at how the area would change under those different scenarios, how it did change from 97 to 2011, how the unit values would change due to different management regimes and things like that, and then what the implications of that would be for the whole system. And the bottom line here is that yes, we can continue down this path of losing ecosystem services. And the market forces or fortress world scenario, we're losing significant value. We can sort of stem that flow with policy reform, or we can reverse things and begin to rebuild these systems in the Great Transition scenario. That implies, by the way, that we do deal with climate change, that we do manage our systems much more effectively. We know how to do all of these things. Those solutions are there. It's really a matter of implementing them and recognizing that the cost of not doing those things is really significantly greater than the cost of doing them. So that is distributed around the planet in different ways, largely because where those ecosystems mainly are and how they're changing. We can pull out each individual country, and you can see that by our estimate for Australia, we have the possibility to lose 20 to 30% of the value of these services in Australia, which are already significantly larger than Australian GDP. We can sort of stem the flow, or we can really increase or rebuild those systems quite significantly. Oops. So, what is the underlying problem here? Well, I think as Philip probably and many others probably already told you, GDP is the wrong measure, the wrong goal to be pursuing, for all of the reasons I'm sure you went into, right? Yes, okay. I won't go into those things again. But I'm sure he mentioned the genuine progress indicator as one way of getting at that. and the fact that natural capital and the damages to natural capital are a major component of that, as are the value of household and volunteer work and the social capital costs, etc. I'm not sure if you mentioned anything about this. No. So we did recently sort of a meta-analysis and tried to pull together all of the GPI studies that have been done around the world. And we got 17 countries, which were responsible for well more than half of the global population and GDP, with different sort of patterns. But in general and overall, we came up with a global GPI versus GDP per capita plot. And you can see that even though GDP per capita was going up over this whole period from the 50s out to just 2005 in this case, the GPI tracked it for a while, till about 1980, but then leveled off and started to decline, largely because of growing inequality in many countries and the damages to ecosystem services and natural capital were probably the two main effects. And I'm sure you probably talked about how this breaks down before. So we're no longer in a period of real economic growth. We're in a period of uneconomic growth. The economy is growing in magnitude and GDP, but it's not really improving well-being. And life satisfaction is certainly tracking this the same way. So we're not improving sustainable well-being. We're only improving how fast we're spinning the wheels. A few governments have picked up on this GPI idea. I'm not sure if you mentioned this at all, but no. So the state of Maryland in the U.S. was the first one to adopt the GPI. There's a really good public television spot that they did on this. The state of Vermont, where Bernie Sanders is from, has written this into legislation. So GPI is sort of required to be produced every year, and they look at this as a policy perspective. But I think we need to go further than that. And this is a paper we did recently looking at how do we need to build models that can measure sustainable well-being, link them with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, recognize that there's many components that need to go into that. But we could come up with a sustainable well-being index that might look something like this, where we start with the GPI, which looks at net economic contribution, so something like that. But then also what's missing from the GPI and needs to be added are the positive contributions from natural capital and ecosystem services, the positive contributions from social and human capital. So how do we build those into the analysis? And then you get those three major components that contribute to well-being. Why haven't we done that? I mean, there's been so much talk over the years about what's wrong with GDP. We should not be using GDP. Even, Simon Kuznets, when they invented GDP, said, don't use this as a social, welfare measure. It's really only measuring activity. So what we need, I think, is a second Bretton Woods type conference. Bretton Woods was the conference in the post-World War II period, right after the Allies had won. Where their primary goal in that period was reconstruction. How do we rebuild this natural capital that we've lost during World War II? So the focus was really on income and GDP growth. Now we're in, the Anthropocene crisis, not the post-World War II crisis. And so we need to shift that primary policy goal to sustainable well-being, not just income and GDP growth. The participants are not just the allied, victors sitting around the table. It's really global citizens and governments. How do we all get involved in this discussion? The institutions then, they created the World Bank and the IMF. We need to create institutions that can really bring together all of these different components. And the measures of progress, then GDP and employment, we need to move to some measures of sustainable well-being and the SDGs and others. And what's about the underlying model? The system of national accounts was mentioned, and that sort of drives the current thinking. We need to go well beyond that, and well beyond even the SIA model, to something that can take into account, a dynamic, integrated approach to how the system has worked historically, is working now, and will work under different scenarios going into the future. And there is a lot of work actually going on in that regard. And I think we're getting some traction, even among some mainstream economists. Joe Stiglitz has been working on this. This is their book they just came out with called Measuring What Counts, the Global Movement for Well-Being. And they're talking about, what we've accomplished so far has convinced us of two things. It's possible to construct much better measures of economic health, and the government can and should go well beyond GDP. And second, there's far more research to be done. How do we put all of these pieces together? Peter Victor has been working on a systems dynamics type model of the Canadian economy. This is the second edition of his book, Managing Without Growth. And there's a whole range of other modeling exercises that are going on trying to do much more of this. And I think going forward, we need to base our system of our goals on these sorts of dynamic integrated models. And finally, I think we need to recognize that there are a lot of different groups working on similar ideas, but are not really coordinated and don't really recognize or know about each other. So there's a new group that's been formed called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And this is a group that is trying to pull all of those things together. You can take a look at their website. There's a really good TED talk by Nicola Sturgeon, who's the First Minister of Scotland. And they formed a government group. So they're sort of the vanguard government group of this alliance. It consists of Scotland, New Zealand, and Iceland, all led by female prime ministers that have acknowledged that the goal of their economy should be to enhance well-being. And you probably heard about New Zealand's well-being budget that they came out with recently. So take a look at this We All Alliance and join if you like. Oh yeah, there's the TED Talk. So you can take a look at that one. I think it's really well done. And finally, I'll end with just a plug for if you want to continue this discussion. There's an Eco Summit that will be happening in the Gold Coast this coming June, which will have room for all of these kinds of discussions. So maybe you can join us there. Thanks very much. There's one question.
This one here.
And by the way, if you want to download any of the papers I mentioned in this presentation, go here.
Thanks for that talk, Professor. I really enjoyed it. Particularly enjoyed the fact you were able to include a Yogi Berra quote in there. You mentioned in there common asset trust.
Yeah.
Could I have your thoughts on who might manage that, please?
Okay. I was hoping you would ask that question. Elinor Ostrom, who was the first woman to win the Reichsbank Prize, the sort of Nobel Prize for economics, got it for her work on common assets and how to manage common assets and how traditional cultures manage them. And so here are her principles, her design principles for managing the commons. And basically, you have to recognize you can't allow the commons to be open access resources. That's Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons was really the tragedy of open access to the commons. So the first principle is you have to have property rights over the commons, but those property rights don't have to be private. They can be community property rights. And traditional cultures have done this, for millennia successfully. But we can update these ideas. And so one idea, for example, that we've proposed is to have an Earth atmospheric trust, that we should think of the atmosphere as really a community asset that we all own together. And it's not open access. We have property rights over that asset. So those that damage that asset should have to pay for those damages, and those that benefit the asset by sequestering carbon can be rewarded for doing that. So we need to think of these common assets and manage them as common assets, not as private assets. etc. So you can take a look at the other rules. The state of Vermont actually has pending legislation. I'm not sure where the status of this legislation is, but they have a bill that was introduced to create the Vermont Common Asset Trust. And recognizing that many of their resources should be held as common assets, should charge and reward in this way, and you manage them similarly to the way a financial manager would manage a financial trust. You want to protect the capital asset and live off the interest. Does that answer the question?
Thank you very much for a really engaging talk. There's a slight lull in the bushfire situation at the moment, so we can start to take stock. Most of that seems to be in terms of loss of property and human life, but also I'm just wondering how you would begin to approach assessing the natural capital loss that we are facing and what benefit that would have in terms of arguing for change.
If I understand the question, could you give it one more try?
How would we begin to approach assessing the natural capital loss that the current bushfire situation has
from the bushfires
cost, and how, in what way would that galvanise arguments against?
Yes. No, I think we have significant information that could be brought to bear on that topic. I mean, we know what those forests are doing, at least roughly. Again, one of the issues here is that these interactions are complex. We really don't know everything that's going on. We have a subset that is gradually expanding when we talk about what the interactions and benefits are. But I think most of the studies I've seen on forests show that the benefits of an intact forest are significantly larger than the benefits of of harvesting the forest, and so if you're not even harvesting but burning it down, you're losing all of those benefits, at least in the short run. So we could assess what the last loss of those benefits are due to the. And you could compare that, if you like, with what would it have cost us to mitigate those losses, if we had put more effort into controlling the fires early on or whatever. I'm sure that those costs would have been minuscule compared to the lost benefits. Not to mention the lost homes and built capital and people.
Carol Bailey, Mount Barker. I come from a council which is in the eastern Adelaide Hills. So from the point of view of recent bushfires, we've completely blown our carbon budget in greenhouse gas emissions due to unprecedented and unforeseen fires. We've also got a problem with waste assimilation, with livestock burial. Yeah. All these things are unforeseen. And what worries me is I think we're running, as a species, we're running out of time. I see you got some good slides of Uluru. The valuation there wasn't just based on the recent valuation of that monolith, was based on cultural values rather than ecological values. So we have double problems here because we have cultural values assigned to things as well as ecological values. There are some very interesting rock pools on what used to be Ayers Rock, which I was privileged to see in the 60s. And I just wonder what happens to the wildlife there, if we don't judge the ecological values as well as cultural values. And I think that, when you consider that the human race has gone from, a 1 billion population in about 1814 to adding another nearly 7 billion in the last 200 years, I think we are running out of time and we need to address population growth as an issue. It's great to run around working out values on ecoservices and values on cultural values, but while we try to judge the difference between a centuries-old river red gum and a neem tree, I think we need to look at population growth because that seems to be the biggest problem to me. Mm-hmm. Would you agree on that?
I agree. Yeah, and a big problem there is also, equity and distribution of those resources, and recognizing, I mean, the people that are pro-population growth are for it because they can't see how the economy can keep growing without population growing. We don't need the economy to keep growing. What we need is the economy to get better, to have more equitable distribution, better protection and management of our natural capital assets. We want sustainable well-being. We don't want GDP growth. Not anymore, anyway. Or not that you don't need it anywhere, but I think you have to recognize that GDP is a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. And to the extent that it contributes to this larger goal, fine. To the extent that that acts against this larger goal, then we have to really tone that in. So yeah.
It's on? Ah, good. Now, I've got a little bit of a comment, and it's something I'm struggling with over the last couple of days, and it's to do with the language we use. Because I hear two things. One is that economists need to become more humble and relate and work with other disciplines because we don't have all the answers, etc. But then a lot of language we use is distinctly economic, perhaps not jargon, but concepts. So when you use the term ecosystem services or something like ecological services, think, okay, that's a sort of economic idea about things, or human capital, or in the pipeline, or the buffer stocks that we heard about. For me, I get slightly sort of uncomfortable, because I think we're trying to say, yes, let's broaden out our understanding and become more all-embracing and work with others, but we still use concepts that, in a way, disclose a rather a limiting way of thinking about things. And I was just thinking about, if we were to have 3 conferences on this very topic of sustainability, one from the point of view of human justice and social rights, one from the economists, and another from the question of human culture and development, and they used concepts from their own sphere, how that would actually really enrich the dialogue, because we think we're in a danger that the economic talk has been the only talk in town for so long that we need to actually start undoing some of our habits. So it's a little bit of a comment, and I'm happy to have some feedback on it, but it's just something that's been living with me.
Well, economists don't own these concepts. And I think the goal is to use whatever language, whatever terms work for the kinds of ideas that you're trying to use and to the audience that you're communicating with. And I put this slide back up because I think that's part of the problem, is that we have all these communities talking among themselves, using their own special language without reaching across to other groups. How do we build a shared language? Well, the way to do that is to build a shared vision, to work on shared problems, to work on these things together. And I don't think the language should get in the way. And I don't think it's, don't think that just because we use the word capital, that this is all economics and has nothing to do with anything else. We're using the term capital in a different way. You're saying capital is a stock of something that contributes to the flow of a benefit. Natural capital, by saying it that way, you're sort of getting it into the minds of people who think in those terms. But that's not the only term you could use, and I think there are certainly lots of synonyms that could be applied. We could talk about just stocks and flows, if that makes you more comfortable, or if that communicates better. But I've found that the term natural capital does get across to a much larger audience than you would get across to if you just said stocks and flows or other terms. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't or couldn't use those terms as well. And we need is really a glossary of synonyms. These things are all synonyms, and which one you use, your preference, your audience, etc.
Ian Lowe, Robert. A related question. I'll preface it with a comment. I was in the UK when Rio Tinto wanted to open a copper mine in Snowdonia National Park. And there was a huge outcry and they argued that the national park was worth more as extracted copper than it was as somewhere where people wandered around with rucksacks and climbing poles. And they said that people should say how much they value the national park so they'd know at what point it became preferable to mine it. Do you worry that in adopting this eco-services approach we are, as James Juniper put it, accepting the lens of capital and accepting that we can only defend protecting the natural area, if its value as ecosystem services is greater than the value that could be produced by digging it up, and that it's for sale if only at some point it's worth more being dug up or mined than it is being kept as a natural area?
Well, the key word used there was only, and I think that's not the right word to use, because this is additional information that you bring into the discussion. It doesn't make sense to me to say, oh, we shouldn't use that information, because somehow you think it's too economic or whatever. But if you can show that the value of that natural park, because of all of the other things that it's doing, is much larger than the value of the mining operation, then that's a good piece of information to put on the table. It doesn't mean it's the only thing that you put on the table or the thing that should decide the thing in the end, but I would certainly not ignore it. It's a really powerful and important way to affect the decision, and we've been ignoring it for too long, and then because then the mining operation could come in and say, well, here's our numbers, and this is showing. The other side says, well, they wave their hands and don't have any ammunition really to put into that argument. Who wins? So I think we have a lot of ammunition to put into the argument on the side of preserving natural capital now, and I think we should use that information, but certainly not the only bullet. And it's not silver, that's for sure. It's more of a green bullet, I think.
Hello, am I on the air?
You are now.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your talk. One of my great heroes was the late Kenneth Boulding, and I did an oral history of him called A Man for All Systems. I was going to ask you, have you found his ideas still relevant, and have you ever interacted with him?
Yes, as a matter of fact, and the first book that we did was kind of a collection of essays that he contributed a chapter to. He came to the first conference of ecological economics in 1990 at the World Bank, and his contributions about the coming economy of spaceship Earth, I think, were kind of a core idea that sort of informed ecological economics, that we have to think of the economy of this spaceship that we're on now, and manage it from that perspective, not just the frontier economics of an empty world. So the empty world, full world, spaceship versus cowboy economy, I think were key elements that informed and started ecological economics. He actually wrote a limerick. I can't repeat it, but that's in this book that came out in 1991. I might be able to look it up for you, but it was really pretty funny.
I think I've got it in my history.
Sorry?
Yes. And did you know that Ken Arrow was working on natural capital in the years before he died?
Yes. Yeah.
Many ecological economists would argue that Kenneth Boulding's paper, The Economics of the Coming Spaceship Earth, is the quintessential ecological economics. And in fact, I'd invite everyone to read that. It's only about a 12-page paper. It's not technical, but it's worth reading.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the name, please, of the paper?
Oh, Kenneth Boulding?
The paper by Kenneth Boulding, The Economics of the Coming Spaceship Earth, is the name.
There was also Herman Daly's paper in 1968 called Economics as a Life Science. I think that was another way of reformulating, what is it that we're trying to do here with economics.
Is there any chance that it might be helpful to have a look at the ragged trousers philosophers again?
I didn't get it either. We're not quite getting it up here, but say it slowly.
The ragged trouser philanthropists.
The ragged trouser philanthropists. Is that right?
By Robert Tressel.
Okay. Thank you for that. Great title.
Yes, it's Ali here. I am asking for your comments in 2 points that I'd like to raise. One of them is about the question the gentleman from other side mentioned about the language and economics. That's why we are approaching all these issues from economic perspective. My perception is that because those who are in power and control all the economic activities and rest of it in the society, they claim and they use economic terminologies for their behavior and controlling all the activities of the society, I mean the politicians. That's why automatically people, consciously or unconsciously, have moved towards that to use these ways of speaking and explaining the things to the public, perhaps. And the other one is that human behavior is one of my perception is that that it was in your models as well, is the key factor. And our behavior is being directed by mass media and also politicians again. And are there ways that we can change it? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, in answer to that second question, I think that's what this group is all about. How do we, how do we present a united front? I think the problem is the majority of people on the planet, I think, would agree with the kinds of future that we're talking about, would prefer that kind of future. We've done some surveys along those lines. But they're not coordinated. They're not presenting a united front. They're not affecting the political decisions. But they could, and I think part of the problem is getting them to work together better. In terms of the language, I think I answered that before. But when we were creating the field of ecological economics, or the journal Ecological Economics, there was a lot of discussion about, well, shouldn't we call it sort of bioeconomics or economic ecology, or why ecological economics? And I think the reasoning was that, well, economics needed the most help. Ecology was really already kind of a broader conception of the world. So we wanted more of an ecological approach to economics. And I think that's what we're trying to do. But again, I don't think anybody owns these terms. And if you can use them in a more of a jujitsu kind of way, then I think that helps as well. And I don't think simply by saying something is capital, is buying into the whole economics agenda or way of thinking about the world. Quite the contrary. I think it's a way of recognizing that there's more to it than simply the things that normally are considered to be capital. There's other things that are really even more important as assets.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it at that. We've got a couple of important announcements for Gabby to make, but could we all please thank Robert for his wonderful presentation. Thank you.